gaze is closed, but some never rest. When silence screams, we listen. This is dead and wrong.
Welcome back to another wonderful episode, everyone. I'm Liz,
And I'm Sam.
and this is Dead and Wrong, your weekly podcast for all things dead. People, animals, ghosts, you name it. If it's dead, we're gonna talk about it.
And today we are finally getting ahead of the game.
In fact, we are. I'm off work, so we decided to do a mass recording session. Sam gets to hear me talk, like always, and I get to hear her talk. Anyways, let's get started on our wonderful 13th episode. Episode 13 presents the 1985 Rulo cult killings. Let's start off this episode with a quick talk about who, basically, in a way, was the true cause for everything we are about to hear about in today's episode. This man is James Paul Wickstrom. James was a die-hard Christian and took Christianity to the extreme. He held anti-government sentiments and preached constantly about Christian identity theology. James ran for various Wisconsin offices as an independent candidate through the 70s and 80s, which, for someone who is supposedly anti-government and you're basically running for a government position, kind of funny.
That's pretty funny.
It is. I hate government, but let me run for a government position. So,
They destroy us from the inside, right?
true. So, a second ago, I mentioned Christian identity theology. For anyone who doesn't know, the identity theology part of Christianity is not focused around the religion aspect, but more so race. Basically, James was all for removing the Jewish race, anyone who was non European, homosexuals, drug addicts, and race traders. Does this whole thing kind of sound familiar to you, Sam?
What's a race trader? Sounds so
Like
stupid.
slave traders, I'm
Oh,
assuming.
it's still stupid. They shouldn't
Yeah.
have done that anyways.
But like his ideologies, do they sound familiar to you? Does this
um,
sound like
kind of
somebody
like
else who maybe believed that Celtics and the Germans were the ultimate race?
Hitler?
Or that James believed the ultimate race was the Aryan race?
Yeah, he sounds like he's trying to take after Sir Hitler.
Yes. So James, as I'm sure all of you can tell, was extremely racist and one of the most famously known white supremacists. In other words, he was a piece of shit.
Let's just add that to another white supremacy crap. Go.
Yes.
Okay.
And as I'm sure you're wondering, well, what does James have to do with this episode? Well, you see, one young man, Michael Wayne Ryan, came across the rallies of James while he was in his young 30s and became hooked with what James was preaching. Michael, who was born in 1948, was a high school dropout who had to work multiple manual labor jobs in order to support his wife and children. He had been working as a truck driver when he injured his back and was forced off the road. Facing pressure from the financial side of things and the pain from the injury, Michael started using marijuana. Which, side note, there is nothing wrong with that. It does not make you a bad person.
Nope.
And he was also in desperate search of something that could provide him with spiritual strength to get through the challenges he was currently facing in life. Now, quick little mini history lesson. At this time, during the 70s and 80s, America was going through the most severe economic downturn anyone had seen since the Great Depression in the 20s and 30s. This was mainly because the Vietnam War had ended in 1975, and in 1980, the Iraq-Iran War started. So, usually, as most people know, wars equal economic declining. Happens every single time. So
Big old.
basically, Michael was going through it and he needed spiritual help, which is not a bad thing. If you need to go search for spiritual guidance and help, that is not a bad thing, unless you're James Paul Wickstrom. For Michael, who was in a very bad spot in every aspect of his life, James was his saving grace, and it didn't take long for Michael and James to get close. James taught Michael the basic tenets of the Christian identity movement. This included the anti Semitism ways, which is basically the extreme hate of the Jewish race.
You have a really bad time with saying that.
I do, Jewish race.
There you go.
But what doesn't make sense with that is that they followed a lot of Jewish ways. So they actively used the Hebrew name for God, Yahweh, and even followed the traditional kosher diet. So yes,
Is that really how you say it? Yahweh?
yeah, I looked it up.
You Googled it? Okay.
It that one is.
Yahweh?
I spelled it wrong right there.
Hmm?
It's spelled right the rest of the way, but yes, it's Yahweh. Because
All
I
right.
even listened to some podcasts about this, and they all pronounced it Yahweh. So they thought, these two men especially thought that the Jewish race needed to be destroyed, but basically everything that our supremacists believed in, it was the same thing that the Jewish people did. And it wasn't just the ways of thinking that Michael learned from James. Found throughout certain court documents of the case, James apparently taught Michael something known as the arm test.
Wait, arm wrestling?
No. So this test, and I'm just using like James as the way to describe it. So James would hold out a person's arm about 90 degrees from their body, so literally just raise it straight up. He
Okay.
would then take, so say they raised their right hand, he would take his left hand and put it on their shoulder. And then he would take their right hand and put it on their wrist. And then while in this position, James would ask Yahweh a question and then apply pressure to the raised arm at the same time. If the arm dropped, the answer was no. If the arm stayed raised, the answer was yes. In reality, James or whoever was administering this test, they had full control. They could do less pressure if they liked the person and the arm would stay raised, or they could do more pressure and this arm would drop.
So it's a rigged test.
Yes, this test was
Hmm?
simply a technique that allowed James and eventually Michael the control they needed for their followers. Basically, if they wanted someone out, suddenly their arm would start dropping a lot. So, throughout all this, it didn't take long, and Michael became known as James's main man in Kansas. And it was through one of these rallies with James that Michael met widower Rick Stice. Rick was a struggling pig farm owner in Rulo, Nebraska, who lived with his 3 children. Rick eventually invited Michael, his family, and his current followers to move onto the farm. Once,
Why?
oh, you know. Once they moved in, they would spend their evenings studying the Bible, smoking pot, and gathering a mass amount of weapons in preparation for Armageddon. And this farm is where all the horrors of this case happen. Now, I was curious, and I'm sure you are too, Sam, but how exactly did Michael get everyone to follow him and eventually commit these crimes? Because with cults, especially, and like every cult I've ever heard about, it's the one thing I'm curious about is like, what about the person drags you in so deep?
I don't know. I don't think I really, well, no. I was gonna say I don't really like anybody enough to kill for them, but there's a few people.
Emmett,
I could get it.
your daughter joined the cult of Daisy.
She created the cult of Daisy.
She got followers pretty quickly. By the way, if anybody wondering, Daisy is one of our friend's dogs. It was really cute.
That's funny.
So, for Michael, for all of his followers, he told them constantly that he spoke to Yahweh just like James. But even more so, Michael was possessed by the spirit of the archangel Michael. That's why they had the same names.
How dare he?
And in the Bible, it was Michael who led the army of God against the forces of Satan, which would eventually
Sati.
lead to the apocalypse that would allow for Jesus' second coming. And obviously, the archangel who was possessing human Michael was trying to do the same thing. And it was Yahweh who commanded human Michael to take on multiple wives within this cult. Michael would end up having a total of 4 different wives and would refer to them as his queens, as he
I mean, at
often
least he gave him respect.
referred to himself as the king.
No.
So, and I don't know how he did it again, But these followers were so devoted to Michael that Rick, the one that invited everybody to move on to his farm, he ended up giving up his pigs because Michael told him to do so. Because pigs weren't kosher, and therefore they
But you
couldn't
could
be
still,
consumed.
they couldn't eat them, but they could sell them.
Well, that was an issue, but people wondered like, well, if we sell them, how are we going to survive? And Michael was like, simple. We'll steal farm equipment and cattle from other farmers.
Oh yeah,
And then we'll
that was a much
sell the
better idea.
stolen items for money to buy ammunition and firearms for Armageddon so that Jesus can come back a second time. This cult would eventually grow to 25 members before everything started going downhill. And
At
that,
least it didn't get too big.
yeah, that downhill slide would start in early 1985 with cult members James Thim and farm owner Rick. And from this point, I will be referring to James Thim as James. So don't think about it to the prior James. He doesn't get mentioned anymore. Okay.
Just call them.
I wrote down James so many times. It's going to be James. So these two men became prime targets of Michael after they ran him afoul by expressing doubts about Yahweh and the validity of the arm test. They said, no, that doesn't seem
Oh,
too right.
I don't blame them.
You know, rule number one of cult life, never doubt the cult leader. It never goes good for anybody.
Oh,
We've all heard multiple stories of that. So before we continue from this point, I just want to point out a few things that are going to be mentioned. There is going to be the abuse of a child. It's not super long, roughly maybe 2 paragraphs. There is also going to be a short sentence about bestiality. Um, so just caution from this point forward. So, after Michael, 37 years old at the time, was informed of these doubts, James and Rick were demoted to quote unquote slaves who had to sleep outside on the porch, and at various points were forced to copulate with a goat and sometimes even sodomize each other as
oh my
punishments for
gosh.
their doubts. If you don't know
That's
what it is, for copulate, it basically means they had to have sex with a goat.
ew.
And Michael, may he agonize in the deepest depths of hell where he belongs, would even
Yes.
force Rick and his
No,
5-year-old son
no,
Luke to perform acts of oral
no,
sex on each other.
no,
This is the part about the child. So Luke
no.
had nothing to do with what his father Rick was doing. Michael was going after Luke to torture Rick, and that is fucking sick. Leave the kids out of it. Like, what he was doing to these two men were horrible. No doubt about it. But leave the kids out of it.
Why didn't the dad just throat punch Mike?
He was outnumbered.
I don't give a shit. Go down swinging.
So Luke, now a clear target of Michael, was abused constantly. Michael would call him a dog, a mongrel, dog shit. He used a red ink pen and wrote 666 on his forehead, and then claimed he was a child of Satan. Somehow,
Michael's child
he
of
got
Satan.
Rick, Luke's father, to fall in line and whip his own child. During
No.
this time, Rick would leave because of this, but he would eventually come back. And the Rick leaving and coming back is what made Michael force Rick to perform sexual acts on his son. In later events, which came out through court transactions, it was discovered Michael would put cigarette ashes in Luke's mouth,
Oh my
would
god.
spit on him, shot him in the arm once, and at one point tied a whip around his neck and lifted him off of the ground. But the kid had no way
This
of
poor
defending himself.
kid.
Heartbreakingly, and in a way thankfully, on March 25th, 1985, Michael, who by the way was like 6'2", 230 pounds, picked Luke up and slammed him into the cabinet. This
No.
action resulted in Luke receiving a fatal head injury. I mean, Luke went through a lot. There's no doubt about it, but in my eyes, this was a blessing. Like,
That poor
I know,
baby.
he didn't have to suffer anymore, and I'm sure you can agree with me, Sam, he was going to suffer more. I have no
His
doubt
dad just
Michael
needed to
would
throw.
have done so much more.
He needed to kill those people. His daddy needed to kill those people.
He did. So Michael, even more dickish, made James and Rick bury Luke in a shallow, unmarked grave.
Oh my God.
And after losing Luke, Rick attempted to run away multiple times before officially leaving for good on April 4th. He's like, I can't do this anymore, I'm done. Which still fuck him, because he left his other 2 kids there. He had 3 kids total.
And he left him there?
Yep.
Why didn't he just call the cops? Wasn't it his pig farm?
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't he just call the cops?
Because he's a bitch.
Oh my God.
So,
I thought this was going to be a good case. I really hate this case.
I'm sorry.
No, you're not.
You'll like the ending.
I see your face.
You'll like the ending. You'll like the ending. So, seeing as Rick ran away and Luke was no longer with us, Michael basically turned all of his wrath onto James, and James experiences the worst of it all. So, on April 27th, James was beaten by Michael and other male cult members after he was accused of poisoning a turkey that was being eaten at a communal meal. James was then taken into one of the former pig pens and would face days and days of all kinds of horrors before he would be murdered. I'm sorry, Sam. During these days, James was sodomized with the handle of a shovel and a pick by Michael's 16-year-old son Dennis and other cult members Timothy Haverkamp, James Haverkamp, and John David Andreas. These acts would cause grievous internal injuries. After they were done with the sodomy, Michael and the 4 other men whipped James 15 times each, which was a total of 75 lashes. They then shot off the tips of his fingers on his left hand. Michael broke his arm and went as far as removing the skin of parts of his legs with a razor blade and pliers.
Oh my God.
Once that was done, Michael had his son and one of the Haverkamp boys break both of his legs. The last thing James endured was Michael stomping on his chest until his ribs broke, and then Michael ordered one of the Haverkamps to shoot him in the head. Thankfully for James, this ended the torture and he was finally able to find peace. James was buried in an unmarked grave just like Luke. And Michael would only be in the clear for these murders for about 2 months, because everyone always fucks up. In June of 1985, James Haverkamp and John Andreas were caught and arrested for stealing farm equipment in Kansas. As a result of their arrest, the police raided the Rulo farm and the raid resulted in finding a weapon cache that had 150,000 rounds of ammunition and over $250,000 worth of stolen property. Today, like taking that $250K compared to today, it would be $767,223.51 worth of stolen goods.
Jeez.
And while in custody, James and John confessed to everything and told the police everything, including the murders they participated in. They explained everything in detail and even pointed out where the bodies were buried. And with this information, a second raid of the property occurred in late August. The police were able to dig up and recover both bodies of Luke and James Thim. And the best part is that Michael, his son Dennis, and Timothy Haverkamp were all arrested and charged with first-degree murder.
Good.
So roughly a year later, in March of 1986, Michael and Dennis finally went on trial. They had been in jail up to this point. By this time, Timothy had already pled guilty to second-degree murder and was in prison, so all that's left was those 2. At only 16 years old, one of the main things the court wanted to know was why Dennis would participate in all of these horrible acts. Because, he's 16, this has been everything he's known his whole life, so maybe Dennis was just brainwashed, or maybe, for all we know, Dennis could have been being tortured by his own father. And, did these things out of fear. But no, Dennis simply told the courts because that's what Yahweh wanted.
Seriously.
And 18 days after this trial was completed, both Michael and Dennis were found guilty. Part of this
Good.
guilty
They should
charge
be.
came from the help of a prior cult member, Cheryl Gibson. She testified against Michael and his son. Cheryl testified that Michael had told her about the details of the killing of James Thim and how proud he was of Dennis, who had eagerly wanted to participate in the beginning. And when they were talking about it, Cheryl said Michael and Dennis were laughing and joking about his death.
Seriously?
And Cheryl was confident about the date that had happened because her sister Lisa had given birth to a child that day. And basically, Michael used the death of Thim and the birth of this new child to be like, obviously, the baby was born this day because Satan's people were no longer on the farm.
Oh my God. This is ridiculous.
Michael ended up getting charged with first-degree murder while his son was charged with second-degree murder. For the death of 5-year-old Luke, Michael pleaded no contest to second-degree murder. No contest basically means you're not admitting guilt, but you're accepting the conviction and punishment for the charges. But like, if you're not guilty, why would you accept the punishment? It's because you are guilty.
You are guilty.
Later that year in October, Michael was sentenced to death. Dennis was given a life sentence, but was released 12 years later in 1997. This release was apparently contingent on Dennis also pleading guilty to manslaughter. James Haverkamp and John Andreas were sentenced to 26 years in prison for their involvement, but were both released in 1998. Timothy Haverkamp was sentenced to 10 years to life, and after serving 23 years in prison, he was released in 2009. In 2014, the Omaha World Herald found out and reported that the Nebraska Board of Pardons made the rare movement of commuting or reducing Timothy's state sentence and then released him from his lifetime of supervision. For some of these, like them getting released early, I almost wonder if it was because once they took them away from the cult leader, their personality started to change. I don't know. I find it weird that they released them, but. Then, on May 24th, 2015, after almost 30 years in prison, which is ridiculous by the way, because this is Michael, and the fact that he's on death row and 30 years later still hasn't been killed, like this is why there's issues with the death row, because they take forever to kill people. But it's okay, because at 66 years old, he died from cancer.
Good.
And I did
I hope he died.
laugh in a way, like, haha, you deserve it, because Michael had metastatic parotid cancer. And without using the big words to describe it, basically he had cancer of the head and neck, which it's indicated this type of cancer can start as a lump around the cheek or ear area. So basically, he died from face cancer.
Good.
I'm not even mad about that. I am
I'm not either.
100% glad that his stupid face got face cancer and he died. He was a cancer to society.
He was a cancer society. That was horrible.
I'm sorry. When I first looked it up, I thought it was going to be better.
That was horrible.
I'm
That
sorry.
was that was horrible. I was shocked, traumatized the whole time. I don't like you right now.
I'm sorry. What do you think?
I just told you. I'm shocked, traumatized. I hate you right now. That wasn't fun. I don't like you.
I'm sorry. I
Yeah.
also find cults amusing because it's like this one guy who's like, I'm God, and all these stupid people who are like, yes.
Cults are amusing until they do what this guy did.
Yes.
Yeah. Then it's not amusing anymore. That's just
No, but for me, it's the
ridiculous.
ideology of cults that I find hilarious.
As a reminder, because I'm going to change the subject now, our socials are up and running. We have Facebook, Instagram, and are streaming on Spotify, YouTube, and Amazon. And if you could do us a huge favor, please comment and rate episodes and pages. Pages? I don't know. As it helps push us out there to the world. If you have anything you would like to send us or want us to talk about, please send us a message on Facebook or Instagram and email us at deadandwrongpodcast@gmail.com. And we will see you next week with another episode full of all things dead. Goodbye.
Bye, guys.
Bye bye.